The idea was simple: take DC's legendary heroes and build a cinematic universe to rival Marvel's. With Man of Steel, Warner Bros. Launched what they hoped would be the foundation of a billion-dollar franchise. They had Christopher Nolan producing, Zack Snyder directing, and Superman, the most iconic superhero of all time, as their starting point. But by the time Justice League limped into theaters, it was clear the grand experiment had gone off the rails. So how did it all go wrong? To find out, let's take a look at how the Snyderverse failed. While brainstorming ideas for The Dark Knight Rises, writer David Goyer hit a creative wall. So he shifted focus and began reimagining a new take on Superman, framing the story around a bold question: what would really happen if a godlike alien arrived on Earth? When Christopher Nolan asked Goyer what he had come up with for the next Batman film, Goyer instead pitched him the Superman concept. Nolan was so taken with the idea that he immediately called Warner Brothers and struck a deal to produce the film, with Goyer writing the script. Nolan, uninterested in directing another superhero film, began to look for a director. And while Nolan considered directors like Tony Scott, Zack Snyder was ultimately chosen, partly in response to the criticism leveled at Superman Returns for its lack of action and more restrained visual style. Snyder, known for his bold, stylized visuals in films like 300 and Watchmen, offered a completely different approach. His signature style promised exactly what Nolan felt the previous film lacked. With Superman's extraordinary powers demanding a sense of scale and spectacle, Snyder's approach promised a film that would deliver the visual impact and intensity fans had been missing. However, Snyder's approach would later spark controversy for going too far. The climactic battle between Superman and Zod sees much of Metropolis reduced to rubble, with massive collateral damage and countless implied civilian casualties, something many viewers felt was out of step with the character's values. Originally, Zod was meant to be pulled back into the Phantom Zone, but Snyder found that resolution unsatisfying and pushed for a darker ending, where Superman kills him. Christopher Nolan strongly opposed the idea and didn't even want the scene to be written, but Snyder and Goyer proceeded anyway, crafting a scenario where Superman has no choice but to kill Zod to save an innocent family, resulting in Nolan ultimately giving it the go-ahead. Regardless, it still ignited backlash, with many fans feeling that Superman, meant to be a symbol of hope, was acting in a way that felt out of step with the core of the character. While the action in the film was praised for its spectacle, the film as a whole was criticized for its somber tone, muted color palette, and a brooding, emotionally burdened portrayal of Superman. Snyder was at the heart of the criticism, with some arguing he didn't fully understand the character, a criticism that was also leveled at his adaptation of Watchmen, with him prioritizing style over substance. As Snyder began developing a sequel to Man of Steel, Warner Brothers, disappointed that the film hadn't become the cultural juggernaut on par with Nolan's Dark Knight films they were hoping for, pushed for him to expand his vision. Snyder had explored the idea of including Batman in Man of Steel 2, and with the studio eager to launch their own version of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they pressured him to move forward with Batman as the film's antagonist. Instead of a proper sequel to Man of Steel, Snyder pivoted to Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice, a film that not only introduced Batman, but also crammed in Wonder Woman and laid the groundwork for the Justice League. Snyder and Nolan briefly considered placing Man of Steel within the same universe as Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, but ultimately decided it wouldn't work. Nolan felt his grounded, realistic take on Batman left little room for a character like Superman to exist naturally. As a result, they chose to recast Batman. The problem was, by choosing to start the universe from scratch, DC gave up the early lead it had over Marvel. Batman Begins hit theaters 3 years before Iron Man, but instead of building on Nolan's successful foundation, they hit the reset button, just as Marvel was gaining unstoppable momentum. David Goyer, who had written Man of Steel, completed an initial draft of the BVS script, but once Ben Affleck was cast as Batman, he pushed for his Argo collaborator Chris Terrio to do a rewrite, unhappy with Goyer's version. Initially, Terrio and Snyder wanted to call the film either Justice League Foundations or Justice League Rising, but the studio insisted it be titled Batman vs. Superman, looking to capitalize on the epic matchup between the two heroes. By pitting Batman against Superman, Warner Brothers expected Avengers-level box office returns, and perhaps they would have gotten it if Christian Bale returned to the role, but he didn't, and with Superman facing off against a Batman audiences weren't yet familiar with, the film underperformed. Critics and audiences alike slammed it for its dark tone and sluggish pacing. Aside from the gripping opening and the standout warehouse fight where Batman rescues Martha Kent, much of the film felt dull and overstuffed. The climactic showdown between Batman and Superman was widely seen as underwhelming, with the Martha epiphany, a Terrio contribution, eliciting laughs and groans from many audience members. And Superman's death, just one film after his introduction, felt rushed and unearned, something Nolan also initially opposed. Ask any fan who runs Marvel Studios, and they'll immediately say Kevin Feige, a producer who's become nearly as famous as the heroes he oversees. DC, by contrast, has suffered from a revolving door of leadership guiding its its cinematic universe. Christopher Nolan initially brought Man of Steel to Warner Brothers and helped oversee its development, but once the film was completed, he stepped away, leaving Zack Snyder to take on a larger role. Snyder not only directed Man of Steel, Batman vs Superman, and was now planning to shoot a sprawling trilogy of Justice League films, but also played a key role in shaping the broader DCU, casting major characters like Batman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Cyborg, and The Flash. At one point, Snyder even pitched a standalone Wonder Woman film set during the Crimean War, before screenwriter Alan Heinberg came aboard and reworked it into the version audiences eventually saw. To put Snyder's level of control into perspective, imagine if Iron Man director Jon Favreau had not only cast every major Avenger, but also directed all 4 Avengers films, oversaw the direction of the entire MCU, and shaped the tone and trajectory of every hero's story arc. It sounds absurd, but that's essentially the role Snyder assumed, almost by default. As filming began on the first of 3 Justice League films, Batman vs Superman hit theaters, but as the negative reception rolled in, Warner Brothers started to get cold feet. Marvel had laid the groundwork for the Avengers with 5 standalone films, including critical and commercial hits like Iron Man and solid performances from Thor and Captain America. Even with mixed reactions to The Incredible Hulk and Iron Man 2, Marvel's Phase 1 proved you need consistently good films to build a successful cinematic universe. DC, by contrast, had failed to gain the same momentum. Man of Steel, Batman vs Superman, and Suicide Squad, which Warner Brothers heavily meddled with, all underperformed, whether critically, commercially, or both. If audiences and critics weren't responding to these movies, why would anyone be excited for what came next? Snyder had already struck out twice, and now he was shooting part 1 of a massive 3-part epic that Warner Brothers feared no one wanted to see. Not only that, but DC's universe was rushed in an effort to catch up to Marvel. Marvel, by contrast, took the time to introduce each hero to audiences in their own standalone adventure before teaming everyone up in Avengers, whereas DC only gave standalone films to Superman and Wonder Woman prior to Justice League, which then had the arduous task of having to introduce Aquaman, Cyborg, and Flash in the same film, creating a bloated mess. Following the poor reception of Batman vs Superman, Warner Brothers finally recognized they needed their own Kevin Feige, and Zack Snyder to them wasn't it. In response, the studio created DC Films, a new division meant to centralize creative control of the franchise, mirroring Marvel's structure under Feige. Geoff Johns, DC's chief creative officer, and Warner Brothers executive John Berg were appointed to co-lead the division and steer the DCU in a more crowd-pleasing direction. One of their first moves was to overhaul Suicide Squad, injecting more humor, flashy pop songs, and a lighter tone in an attempt to mimic the success of Guardians of the Galaxy. Director David Ayer was ordered to perform extensive reshoots and re-edits using revised material from Geoff Johns, ultimately resulting in a theatrical cut that strayed dramatically from Ayer's darker, more character-driven original vision. Even the climax to Wonder Woman was changed by Johns. Originally, Sir Patrick at the end wouldn't have turned into Ares, which would have served the theme of the film that humans are capable of pure evil, and it was an Ares that caused everyone to go to war. The studio mandated a big, CGI-heavy fight to cap off the movie, much to director Patty Jenkins' frustration. Justice League faced similar studio interference. Johns and Berg not only were on set to babysit Snyder, offering input on where and how to inject more humor into scenes, but in an effort to make the film more like the Avengers, Johns eventually brought in the man behind it, Joss Whedon, and had him rewrite much of the script, which Snyder was forced to shoot. It soon became clear that Warner Brothers was giving Joss Whedon increasing control over Justice League. Initially brought in to rewrite parts of the script, Whedon's role quickly expanded, eventually directing portions of the film himself. Around this time, Snyder's daughter tragically passed away, leaving him emotionally devastated and without the energy to continue clashing with the studio. Ultimately, he stepped away from the project entirely, as Whedon would take over. However, Whedon's extensive reshoots ultimately failed to deliver the results Warner Brothers had hoped for. Justice League underperformed both critically and commercially, falling far short of expectations. In the aftermath, both John Berg and Geoff Johns exited their roles at the studio, marking a clear sign that the attempted course correction had backfired. With Snyder gone, the DC universe stumbled forward with mixed results. Walter Hamada took over and mapped out a vision of his own, one that would culminate in a Crisis on Infinite Earths adaptation. But the path to get there was anything but clear. Alongside the Snyderverse films were elsewhere films like Joker and the Batman that didn't exist in the same universe, further confusing audiences. Planned films like Ben Affleck's Batman were quietly shelved, while others like Batgirl were infamously written off for tax purposes. Meanwhile, during the production of Black Adam, Dwayne Johnson attempted a behind-the-scenes power grab to center the DC universe around his character, a move that ultimately backfired. After Discovery completed its acquisition of Warner Media, the studio once again began searching for their own Kevin Feige, a creative lead to unify the brand and bring order to the chaos. They eventually landed on Guardians of the Galaxy director James Gunn, who made the bold decision to reboot the universe entirely, bringing the Snyderverse to a definitive end. At the very least, Snyder was able to complete his vision for the first chapter of his planned Justice League trilogy with the release release of the Snyder Cut, but it ultimately left us with a universe defined not by what it achieved, but by what could have been. Thanks for watching, everybody, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more of Hollywood's untold stories and unmade movies.